At this point, man is free, and this world filled with oppression and oppressive agents can only serve to make his freedom visible in all its splendor. All right, so we are continuing our discussion of the Forest Passage by Ernst Jünger. How's my pronunciation there, Luke?
It's getting there. It's getting there.
Say it in true German accent.
Ernst Jünger.
Ernst Jünger.
Ernst Jünger.
Ernst Jünger.
Jünger.
Okay, got it. Last time we talked about the first kind of 40 pages or so, and we're going to talk about the rest of it. You might want to check out, if for listeners or viewers, you might want to check out the first one, but we'll dive in and we'll probably give a little bit of background if we're referring to anything that we previously discussed in brief. So you can just jump into this one if you haven't listened to the last one, because in the second half of this, Jünger goes into, as Luke hinted at in our last discussion, into the really juicy bits, some really cool stuff. I mean, the first part of this book was good enough, but wow, the second bit, I was like we could probably do 30 shows just on the last, the second half of this book. So check out the book. It's very short and very fun. Well, fun in a particular sort of way. Where to jump in? So just as a brief overview, the Forest Passage is that it's kind of an alternative option. In our last discussion, we talked about the example of elections and how, like, fraudulent elections, and how participation in them for Jünger is basically what the authorities want. They need you to participate, whether you're going to agree with them or not agree with them. So if they get 98% success, that's what they want, but they also want that 2% or even 1% of dissent, because that feeds into their aims as well. And so you're essentially, by voting your conscience and going against the the mind control and the programming, you're actually feeding into their aims at the same time. So the Forest Passage is a way of regaining your freedom and actually putting up a strong resistance, knowing the rules of the game and being effective within those new rules. I guess, that's maybe an inadequate way of describing it, but that's one aspect of it. We'll get into more as we go on. So where I broke off, I stopped reading kind of for the last show when he was talking about fear and conquering fear. And then this is when he gets into some actual examples, the kind of the meat of the Forest Passage, what it really means. For instance, he gives some examples of how this applies to questions of healthcare, law, and weapons, and even morality itself and crime. So those are the big ones that we could easily devote an entire show each to. So it's hard to know where to start. So what I'm going to do is just dive into one of the chapters where I kind of had the most notes for. So he's talking, I'll just start randomly in section 24, where he's talking about the churches and the role of the church. So he starts by saying, another question is this: how is man to be prepared for paths that lead into darkness and the unknown? Because that's what the Forest Passage is. The fulfillment of this task belongs chiefly to the churches, and in many known and many more unknown cases, it has effectively been accomplished. It has been confirmed that greater force can be preserved in churches and sects than in what are today called worldviews, which usually means natural science raised to the level of philosophical conviction. It is for this reason that we see tyrannical regimes so rabidly persecuting such harmless creatures as the Jehovah's Witnesses, the same tyrannies that reserve seats of honor for their nuclear physicists. And so he goes on basically saying that it shows a healthy instinct that today's youth are beginning to show interest in religion. And so this is kind of hinting at something, that religions and the churches actually provide some kind of purpose. But at the same time, we have to deal with the fact that the religions and the churches themselves have become corrupted. They might have, in a different context, he's talking about words and old words and how they become. Let me see if I can just find it really quick. How they go from he says, because this is in a much later section not on religion, but he says, because some of the rubble blocking the approaches to the forest passage is formed by the grand old words, which first become conventions, then annoyances, and in the end are simply boring. So I'd apply that to religion. One of the problems is that, like, if you look at today, I mean, this applies to me growing up, where for me, going to church was just boring. There was nothing in it that was actually interesting or sparked something in me. But that spark is what the church should provide. And so even in a case where the religion has become kind of brittle and not cool, in a situation like in a catastrophe, as he puts it, the turn back to these questions, it's a symptom of something going on. It's like he describes it very, very often as like a desert, and then from the desert you can get things like a spring or an oasis or a lion coming out of the desert. It's this vitality and this strength and this spark, this immortality that comes through the desert, out of the desert. And so in the context of religion, I'll just read a bit more to see what he's talking about. In this same paragraph, he says, if man looks into himself, he will rediscover this something. And with that, he will create points in the desert where oases become possible. Skipping a bit, one might say that a certain definite quality of religious faith always exists, which in previous times was legitimately satisfied by the churches. Now, freed up, it attaches itself to all and everything. So he's talking about basically how in this situation where traditions are falling apart, there's nothing to hold on to, everything is in a state of flux and chaos, that there's something missing. This sense, it's this sense of something missing that and that sparks a search for something. And that's why he says that's why we see all this activity around what he calls Gnostics, founders of sects, and evangelists, who all more or less successfully step into the role of the churches. But so when all this energy is freed up, when there's this vacuum or this desert, that part of oneself, that part that's looking for something, looking for a direction, looking for something that it knows is missing, it can get caught up in anything, and so it can get caught up in like philosophical fads like Marxism or rationalism or whatever. And he says that this is the gullibility of modern man, which coexists with a lack of faith. He believes what he reads in the newspaper, but not what is written in the stars. And, there's so much good stuff in this chapter. Another one. Certainly there must be something of a priest in every good doctor. But the thought of taking over for the priest can only occur to doctors in times when the distinction between salvation and health has been lost. So he's talking about kind of the role that doctors adopt in this kind of materialistic situation. He says none of the limitations. Therefore we may think Therefore we may think what we want about various imitations of such spiritual instruments and forms as examinations of conscience, confession, meditation, prayer, ecstasy, and others. None of the imitations reach deeper than the symptoms, if they are not actually harmful. So basically we become surrounded by pale imitations of something. It's like, it's these, we know something is missing, and so we latch on to, or someone provides kind of a miracle cure or something. And he makes an interesting statement about miracle cures in the section on health, where he's basically saying, well, what do the snake oil salesmen promise? They promise a miraculous healing, and one that applies to the whole. So it's like it's a panacea, it's a philosopher's stone or an elixir or something like that. And he says, well, they might be frauds, but those two things, those are actually what people are looking for because they're true. And this is what he ties into the forest passage. So in the first part, he's talking about the first part of the book. He's talking about the forest passage, and you can get the impression from the first part that it's mostly just a strategy, that it's maybe like a refined and noble strategy, a way of living within catastrophic times, living in tyranny, and keeping oneself. But in the second half of the book, it morphs into this very like mystical vision of reality and humanity and the purpose of life, and that there's this connection. The forest passage is actually the atemporal, like immortal part of ourselves, and it's the source of the sorts of immense power and regenerative activity and transformative spirit and power. And so that is actually what heals, and that it does heal the whole person, and even makes the point that all health is miraculous, all healing is miraculous, and that and he just throws out all of these little like gems, just like willy-nilly, and they're just kind of mixed in there, and there's so much just in that one statement. Of course, you could get into all of the stuff on like psychoneuroimmunology and the whole mind-body connection and all that, and like placebo and nocebo effects, and how and even that, I think, that's putting in more of a scientific framework where he's really talking about something spiritual. There's a connection. I think that the scientific approach kind of pales in imitation. It's one of those like pale imitations of what's really going on that he mentioned earlier. But even right there, that opens up a whole can of worms on the nature of medicine and the nature of the body and consciousness and the role. What is really going on with healing? Is it purely a mechanical process? Well, to me, it seems like he's saying that no, it's not mechanical. And the very fact that we think of it as mechanical is a product of this kind of desertification of our thinking and our spirit and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I could just keep going. So if anyone has any comments, jump in.
Well, I really felt like we were reading, something by Arthur Versuis, when especially in that center portion of the book, where he gets so poetic and mystical in his definition of freedom and this connection that is innate in all of us, that would facilitate freedom and offer some kind of middle way or resistance to totalitarianism, because that's what all of this is about. It's about the fount, the wellspring of strength that we can all access by recognizing it first in ourselves and creating a greater connection to it and strengthening it. And in that respect, there were several passages that felt like he had drawn upon a lot of the material that Versuis talks about. And just as a reminder, we've had Arthur Versuis on for a couple of shows, one to discuss a book he had written about totalitarianism in like the Middle Ages and what that looked like, but also the forms that it took later on and over the centuries, and but also the flip side of the coin is all the mystics and theologians and religious figures who were like Boehme, who were discussing, the ideas that would help us to connect to this, to a gnosis, to a knowledge within ourselves that already exists if we can acknowledge it, if we can find those. I forget the term that Jünger uses, but he makes mention of writers and poets and individuals who can point the way to some degree. Intermediaries is probably it.
That's one of them, yeah.
So we have only to first kind of acknowledge that this fount exists within ourselves, and then to strengthen that connection. And just before the show, we talked a little bit about the fact that this was originally written in German and translated to English. And so there may have been some pieces of this, for those of you who decide to read this short volume, where it may seem a little bit opaque, but there is so much that is clear here. I think it's worth a look, because what you're doing, the other thing that I mentioned is that you really have to think about what he's saying, and in that respect, this is an exercise in abstract thinking and the philosophy of freedom as it connects to what we're made of, what the substance is of a truly free individual, of a spiritual individual who is willing to fight on some level. And what that fight means to each of us is also something that he acknowledges to be a kind of a scary proposition, because we're in some ways and under some circumstances compelled to make sacrifices and make definite decisions about how we're going to, if at all, fight. So I appreciated him laying it out so clearly, and he does it on a number of occasions. You mentioned, Harrison, I think you mentioned it, the element of fear of death that has to be approached, overcome, dealt with, processed by the individual, because it's from this kind of paralyzing fear of what may come, of risking, that we have the potential to act and to grow and to become aligned with that part of existence that is strong and fighting the good fight, as it were. So lots of lots of stuff in there.
Let me read his definition of freedom. In chapter 31, he writes, the real issue is that the great majority of people do not want freedom, are actually afraid of it. One must be free in order to become free, because freedom is existence. It is above all a conscious consent to existence, and the desire perceived as a personal destiny to manifest it. At this point, man is free, and this world filled with oppression and oppressive agents can only serve to make his freedom visible in all its splendor, just as a great mass of primary rock produces crystals through its high pressure. So I thought that was a really interesting way of formulating it, that freedom is the conscious consent to existence. Luke, your eyebrows went up.
No, yeah. Because I thought his definition of freedom and his thoughts about it was really interesting. Because in a sense he was kind of pessimistic. I think in some passage he said something along the lines that it's pretty pointless actually to try to erect a system, that kind of guarantees freedom or changes our lot, right? So I think he saw it as a kind of a natural law that you go from oppression, you enter periods of oppression and all of that, and therefore freedom can arise again, right? And through the act of the individual can come up again, and that's actually how it works, and not so much that the kind of progressive idea that we march towards a golden dawn of free man or whatever. And I also wanted to add, because Harrison, when you quoted this passage to tap into that well, and generate the oasis, what he actually said in the passage was something very beautiful. I thought it's this idea that whatever created the cathedrals and the great stuff in the past is that he compared it to an underground stream. So it might not be visible anymore. This forest might be hidden, but you can actually get to it and produce a well. And by that, the oasis comes to be. And I thought that's a really beautiful image for the role of the individual and the importance and also the power that lies into like getting to that well. And just 2 quick points, maybe just anecdotes from his life that might be fitting. So first of all, about his sources, or like Ilan, you said he might have used the same sources as Wes Lewis, and it's pretty. I think it's highly probable that he read like the German mystics. And I think in another essay I saw him reference Jakob Böhme, but I'm not sure. But Jünger was a guy, he pretty much read all his life all day long. So he was like really an avid reader. So I'm pretty sure that he has drawn on that German mystic tradition. And about the health thing, so it's kind of funny because I've watched a couple of interviews with him. There are not that many, but there are some also from later in his life. And he was like really skeptical about like modern medicine, and he just apparently he just never saw a doctor, until in his late 90s or whatever. And when he got wounded in the war, obviously, like he got surgery and stuff in the field. So he basically said in the interview, like, yeah, and lately, and he was like already, I don't know, 98 or whatever, or in his 90s, like, yeah, and lately I was for the first time, I was at a doctor, and I mean, I was never ill, right? Except for like when I went to the field hospital, after being wounded. And he just never bothered going, and was deeply skeptical. I mean, he lived 102 years, right, or whatever. So he must have done something right. But I found that passage about the health system and the state of like mechanized health also very, very on point. So that was really great stuff. Yeah.
To piggyback off of that for a second, he, at one point, was talking about, like you're saying, the healthcare system and everything, and what doctors can, or maybe perhaps could, or maybe should do. And he says one really interesting line. Let's see. We are truly alive only insofar as we are able to emerge from mere functionality. And I thought that was really interesting. He touches on this. Well, it's something that he's alluded to a number of times up to that point, where the mechanisms of the machine, of time, of culture, of habit, we become mere functionaries, mere cogs in the machine of culture and economic consequences. We are, just a speck of dust floating through space, basically. But being truly alive and having freedom means stepping outside of it, stepping beyond that. And I think that gets to something that I think you started off with, Luke, where it's freedom comes from something internal. It comes from within, and it can only be realized from within, but it's actualized through action. And so it being an internal phenomenon, then that would explain his rejection of all form of external attempts to make for a greater or more free society, because he realizes that it's a futile effort. It's impossible to make a more free society from the top down, because it is from within and outwards. Maybe you could say to a lesser or greater degree, and maybe within certain worldviews, you can spin like the democratic West as being more free than other well, I guess you could say like the Soviet Union versus the United States in the like 1940s or something. Like maybe that would be, somewhere where you could actually like make a distinction for there being like more freedom in one society versus another, but that doesn't. But I think that his point is that the level of freedom, or what you're really talking about, are different in that freedom can be discussed like normal people discuss in their just like the normal way that we think about like freedom of speech and that kind of a thing. And so you can have more freedoms in that respect, but what's the point of having the freedom of speech if you do not have the inner freedom to actually speak your mind in a way that you think is right or just?
Well, I've noticed that too. That there's a complexity though, and a nuance. Like he's on the one hand, he'll be against these external systems, but he's not a radical. Mm-hmm. So whenever he makes a statement like that, he'll say, well, that's not to say these things are necessarily bad. Like so with the church, he'll say, the church can't do anything for you really, but it's still necessary for this. So he'll say it's better to have a church than no church, but you'll need to go beyond the church in order to gain the true freedom. And same with like, I think, I don't remember if he says this specifically, but I think the same would apply to like the political freedom. He'd probably say, well, it would be better, it would be, I'm not saying anything bad about countries that actually have certain freedoms or more or less follow their constitutions. That's a good thing, but the forest passage is still something that anyone, anywhere, in any system can follow. So there's like it's this stratified level of freedom. And I've noticed this in a lot of discussions, like philosophical discussions on the nature of freedom, where, how to put it? Okay, well, so this is the way I see it. You've got some people that deny any level of freedom, right? We're completely deterministic. And then there are other people who will say, yeah, free will exists, but they'll say, oh, well, we're not free. The only freedom is to make an authentic choice or something. So they're basically making a different point than the materialists are making. Like you've got levels of disagreement. So on the most basic level, you've got the absolute determinists versus the people that say, oh no, in our everyday lives, we actually have free will. That's one
like
level of free will.
Compatibilism, right? Where this idea where you kind of try to have a deterministic material universe, but still kind of make the case that you have freedom in the world of the human beings, right? Something like that.
That's one of them, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that so people will say, no, determinism is wrong. We actually have freedom. Like people actually choose, or there is it's an expression of free will to whatever degree when someone chooses Frosted Flakes over like Cheerios. And then there'll be the people that say, well, that's not a true free choice. That's mundane. That's trivial. And yeah, it is. But that like, how to put it? That's like the first person in this case, the first free will advocate will say, no, materialism is wrong because we actually can make a free choice in terms that the terms that the materialists are thinking of. Like the materialists are thinking it's just purely determined. There's no agent that's actually making a choice. Then this first order free will affirmer will say, well, no, actually that is an expression of free will. And I think that's true. But then on top of that, you can say, oh, well, that's a trivial expression of free will. And I'd say, oh, well, that's true as well. There are deeper levels of free will. It's like, and I can't remember who said, there's a famous quip or something that some philosopher had made about, it's like, oh no, this wasn't actually a famous person. This was in a book on John Bennett's school, Sherburne House. John Bennett being a Gurdjieff proponent and who had a school, an institute where he took a bunch of students for like a year and ran them through a whole course. And so one of the guys working with him, who was essentially teaching a course on I can't remember what the subject was, if it was free will or more broadly like some kind of philosophy or something. And so he was adamant on the mechanicality of man, like straight out of Gurdjieff, right? And so someone had said, well, no, we actually do have some free will. Like, we can choose Cheerios over Chex or Frosted Flakes. And he kind of just dismissed it as, oh, well, but is that even important? Because ultimately it isn't important. So you can see his point. Well, you can see both of their points. You can see how in contra materialism, contra determinism, the person who's saying there is a sense of freedom in the mundane decisions that you make, they're right. But then this guy, like I can't remember his name, who's arguing a more Gurdjieffian perspective, is also right in saying, well, that's still not the depth of freedom. Like when people are thinking about freedom, they're thinking about something that's actually much deeper than that. Like the distinction between determinism and free will in the philosophical debate is a really pedantic one. I think it's important because it lays the foundations for what's possible and what isn't possible, and that you can build on top of. Because it's very hard to build like a philosophy like Junger's on top of like determinism, maybe in a compatibilist view. But if you're starting on the foundation that there's actually an element of freedom in consciousness and in the nature of reality, then that can explain, or that can provide a foundation for, the type of freedom that Junger's talking about. This really, much deeper level of freedom that ties into like the highest level of your being and your innermost soul or animating principle, the thing that makes you you. So basically that's just to say that Junger's aware of these stratified levels and he's aware of the utility of certain things that can only go to a certain level. And so maybe even with, and I think that's kind of implicit even in his discussion of health, where he's against doctors, but he recognizes that doctors can heal. But he's saying, well, there's something else going on there too. And on that point, I just wanted to read a couple excerpts from the section on health. So this ties into the anecdote that you gave, Luke. He said, avoiding doctors, trusting the truth of the body, and keeping an open ear to its voice. This is the best formula for the healthy. Now, note that he said for the healthy. For the sick, a sick man needs a healer. But for the healthy, avoid doctors. And let's see, I'm just going to read the parts that I underlined. A dubious development to be wary of in the highest degree is the constantly increasing influence that the state is beginning to have on health services, usually under philanthropic pretexts. I'll just say that some of the things that he writes in this chapter sound like they could have been written in the last couple of years.
Yes.
He says, moreover, given the... Now, get this. So he's writing this probably writing it in 1950-ish, published in 1951. Moreover, given the widespread release of doctors from their doctor-patient confidentiality obligations, a general mistrust is also advisable for consultations. It is impossible to know which statistics one will be included in, also beyond the health sector. It sounds like he might be talking about social media as well there.
Surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
The one about the germs or like the hygiene, you got that one? That was pretty. I think it's in the same paragraph or same page or something, but it talks about like the hygiene and where like they're overdoing it with the vaccines and hygiene and stuff, and therefore like the whole. I don't know. I just thought it might,
and all of the things that they try and do to help people and make them stronger and more resilient actually leads to the actual opposite effect, where people become more susceptible and weaker. Because he uses the context of like somebody on the Titanic, getting thrown overboard into the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean. And if somebody has been living their whole life in this comfortable situation where everything's climate controlled, fully vaccinated, never had to do like, hard manual labor or something along those lines, where that weakens your constitution to where if you're thrown into such a dire situation as being in freezing cold waters, you will likely be overwhelmed and ill-suited to the task.
Okay, I found it. So when a ship goes down, its dispensary sinks with it, with all its medicines. Then other things become more important, such as the ability to survive a few hours in icy water. A regularly vaccinated and sanitized crew, habituated to medication and of high average age, has a lower chance of survival here than a crew that knows nothing of all this. A minimal mortality rate in quiet times is no measure of true health. Overnight, it can switch into its opposite. It is even possible that it may generate previously unknown contagions. The tissue of the people weakens, becomes more susceptible to attack. So that, And then, so on that subject a bit previously, he makes, I'll just read the point that I alluded to earlier about the miracle cures. He says, however crudely they may ply their trade, these conjurers differ in two important aspects. First, in their treating the patient as a whole, and second, in portraying the cure as miraculous. It is precisely this that a still healthy instinct seeks, and on which the cure is based. And then I've got an anecdote for this next one. So he says, whenever a doctor with human substance appears on the scene, the mechanism can be broken, neutralized, and made... Oh, what's he talking about here? I'll just start from the beginning of the paragraph. Needless to say, similar things are also possible in conventional medicine. Anyone who heals participates in a miracle, with or even despite his apparatuses and methods. And it is already a step forward if he recognizes this. Wherever a doctor with human substance appears on the scene, the mechanism can be broken, neutralized, and even made useful. Naturally, such direct care is hampered by bureaucracy. Yet, ultimately, it is also true that on the ship, on the Titanic, or even in the galleys where we live, there will always be men who break through to pure functionality, be it through their kindness, their freedom, or their courage in taking direct responsibility. A doctor who does something for a patient against the regulations may, by just such initiative, lend miraculous power to his means. We are truly alive insofar, this is your sentence, as we are able to emerge from mere functionality. And this, well, of course, I'm sure people can think of some contemporary examples where that may be the case, but there was another one that I had, and this was something I heard about traditional Chinese medicine. And how in China, and I'm not sure if this is everywhere in China. I'm not sure if this was just one particular city or if it was kind of across the board in, government clinics all across the country. But at the very least, in one hospital in one city, because they do Chinese traditional medicine in China. But the thing about TCM is that it's supposed to be geared towards the individual, right? The doctor will look at the individual and then come up with an individual protocol based on symptoms or whatever. And then there are certain, things that they will do for that person. But the system has become bureaucratized. At least, like I say, I won't necessarily say it's across all of China because I don't know. At the very least in this, in this system, in this one city, where the doctors were only allowed to give one type of treatment for one type of illness. So it's like it's basically become a checklist where the person comes in and has these complaints. Okay, these complaints, well, I do this thing. And that's all they're allowed to do. That's all they're allowed to do. They're not allowed to give any kind of other, they're not allowed to deviate from the prescribed protocol. And so, because if they do, then that opens them up to lawsuits if something goes wrong. They're not following order. They're not following the directions, so they can, they might fall under. They might be penalized just for not following official guidelines. But at the same time, they're ineffective. So there was this doctor that was complaining about it and saying, "I'm not allowed to actually treat my patients." As a doctor, it's supposed to be my goal to look at them and give them the treatment that they need, and not the one that's just prescribed in this one-to-one relationship. Oh, they come in for this complaint, do this one thing. It's like, well, that's not the way it works. That's not the way it's supposed to work. But it's become so bureaucratized that they're only allowed to follow the flow chart that they're provided by the health regulators. And of course, there are connections to be made to medicine all over. That's essentially what is. That's the vision of like the WHO and health regulators across the world, is to make that you can only follow these specific directions in these specific cases, and if you deviate at all, if you actually use
medicine for off-label.
Yeah, exactly. If you become creative at all, and if like how did Jünger put it? If you do something for a patient against regulations, and Jünger is saying that just doing that, by just that initiative, you might lend miraculous power to your means. Because if medicine isn't just this mechanical, okay, healing. If there's something else that's going on there, you're actually cutting off what is potentially the most potent healing power that might be part of this entire process. And that's some speculation, at least. But did you guys have any more thoughts on that?
Well, just a reminder in terms of what we're seeing today. And I mean, everything we just discussed speaks so strongly to the fact that Jünger was, he was clearly tapped into something. He was clearly insightful in the way that he looked at perennial problems with the way that people are managed, and the way their thoughts are managed, the way their health is managed, the way their freedom is managed, the way that they're terrorized by the interrogation of questionnaires and polls and events that are presented in just such a way as to give them the feeling that they have no real choice in the matter, or that they falsely feel that they do have a choice in the matter, but are falling into the trap of presenting an answer or a check mark for something that isn't really a choice. And along the lines of the medical bureaucracy, there have been some really compelling stories of doctors. I remember one recently where a doctor in, I think it was Washington, who was either a surgeon or an internist, had an impeccable reputation at his hospital, was quite unwilling to go along with the hospital administration's guidelines for treating patients with COVID with like remdesivir and ventilators. And so they were trying every way to get the doctor out of the system when, he was, by all the rules of the hospital, questioning and challenging all of the challenges that were being put to him. And finally, the end of the story is he moved out of the state and started a kind of, practice on his own in another state altogether, where he gave himself the freedom to treat people in the ways that he felt were actually beneficial. And so, I read that recently, and I thought that's the Forest Passage. This physician found his own way through his own light and whatever influences and wisdom and insight he had, to recognize that he could not, in the capacity that he wanted, serve as a healer, where he had served as a doctor for decades and had, prior to COVID, an impeccable reputation. So that comes to mind. And I did want to read a passage here that, Jünger calls this the science of abundance, and makes reference to literature. So he's drawing upon all kinds of influences and in presenting his book here. And this was just one more that we haven't gotten into yet. And I'm going to read this real quickly and just mention its significance, I think. He writes, giving this man an inkling of what has been taken from him, even in the best possible present circumstances, and of what immense power still rests within him, this is the theological task. A true theologian is someone who understands the science of abundance, who transcends mere economy, and who knows the mystery of the eternal springs which are inexhaustible and always at hand. By a theologian, we mean someone who knows, and a knower in this sense is the little prostitute, Sonia, who discovers the treasure of being in Raskolnikov and knows how to raise it to the light for him. This is from Crime and Punishment. The reader senses that these gifts have been brought to the surface, not for life alone, but also for transcendence. This is a great aspect of this novel, indeed of all of Dostoevsky's work, which acts like a breakwater on which the errors of the times are pulverized. These are talents that emerge more clearly after every new catastrophe, and in which the Russian pen has achieved world status. And I was so delighted to read that reference to Crime and Punishment and Raskolnikov's journey and the revelation that Sonia, the archetypical prostitute with the heart of gold, provides for the character, and was a reminder also of how guys like Peterson are constantly mentioning read Dostoevsky, because what Dostoevsky does is he presents the very internal struggle in many ways that individuals have as they are either on the wrong track to the forest passage or at least have some hope for redemption and are on the way to the right track of this forest passage. So I appreciated that very much, and it was a reminder to me and maybe to us that we'll get around to reading The Possessed, otherwise known as The Devils, because what we're watching right now is and he brings up nihilism as this kind of counterpoint to what he is recommending folks pursue in the forest passage. There is this struggle that is both existential and personal in how we interact with the world, between nihilism and finding this science of abundance. And along those lines, he also says, abundance is not this purely material thing. In fact, you can get bogged down in the materiality of abundance. You can, supposing in preparation for the catastrophe, as he puts it, you accrue all of these many things in preparation. But it can also weigh you down. It can also be an encumbrance. And he qualifies that too, that it is important to prepare to some degree, to put yourself through a kind of exercise in thinking about what a catastrophe means and how to respond to it. But I think he's really thinking about and trying to get us to think about what drawing upon this science of abundance means in a non-materialist sense, and that it can provide us in some great measure a way to move forward under the most dire circumstances.
That was really interesting. His section on property. I'll read something to give the flavor of what you're talking about there, Ilan. So, property in this sense is existential, attached to its holder and inseparably connected with his being. He goes on, anyone who has lived through the burning of a capital or the invasion of an Eastern army will never lose a lively mistrust of all that one can possess in life. This is an advantage, for it makes him someone who, if necessary, can leave his house, his farm, his library without too much regret. He will even discover that this is associated with an act of liberation. Only the person who turns to look back suffers the fate of Lot's wife.
Yeah, that I remember that passage too. That kind of caught my attention. That was very well said, and I think coming back to this discussion about freedom, because I think that all kind of ties into that. I was just thinking about like this discussion you mentioned, Harrison, and that actually like the idea of free will starts getting interesting when we ask like specific questions about it, right? Or how it really plays out in real life, and not so much the nerdy kind of logic chopping or evil materialist versus like I don't know, compatibilist, and then with all these stupid examples, you know, that analytic philosophers like love. And the thing is, I mean, I'm not going to say that it's external freedom isn't important, or that a free society is not important. I don't think Jünger would say that like that too, right? As you guys said, he's not. He's always qualifying, and he kind of tries to look at the deeper picture, right, at the deeper level of reality. And he always has this metaphysical lens through which he looks at things. So I don't think he wants to make that point, but it's kind of an interesting question, right? What society would you rather live in, right? Like a totalitarian Soviet society where like the people don't buy the propaganda, right? And kind of make a show, but you still have your buddies and you can crack jokes about the stupid regime. And you can find ways to, you know, organize your own little subversion and trade stuff and whatever, you know, organize like all kinds of cultural things. And you have like this flowering, like human life, like underneath the thing. Or do you want to live in a society that is like free? You know, everybody could do all kinds of great stuff, but nobody does, you know, because everybody is like totally dumbed down and degenerate, right? I mean, in what society is better, right? So it's kind of an interesting question, and obviously these are related to some extent, in a sense that it seems to be like kind of like a cycle, right? I mean, with if society gets freer and there are less obstacles, and then people start getting degenerate and stupid and all that, and then it gets more. Things fall apart, or it gets more totalitarian again, and people start waking up, and then reclaiming their freedom and reclaiming their tradition, reclaiming their intelligence, and basically the forest passage thing can take place again, and to renew all of that. And so I find it's kind of an interesting discussion, because so much of these discussions around freedom, they're about like constitution and rights and legal issues and this and that. And obviously like that's important, but it is worthwhile thinking about the true meaning of freedom for the individual, and a deeper sense of the word.
Yeah, stepping outside of the purely legalistic material, stepping outside of the state's pre-prescribed notions of what is or isn't freedom or free, stepping outside of that back into the transcendent and the metaphysical, which is where, like he's alluded to, that's where real freedom lies, in this transcendent of time, the transcendence of time and of death, and all of these things that rise and fall and change.
Well, I would just add, just as an observation, that there have been so many more pundits pundits and authors nowadays who are framing the political developments we're seeing in the West right now in spiritual terms as, quote unquote, good against evil. And, in injecting God and spiritual values into the kinds of discussion of policies that are being put into place right now in the world. And Jünger talks about the fact that, in his opinion, it would only require a small percentage of the population who really sees and gets it to act on behalf of this larger sleeping mass of people to affect some kind of change. And so it's just, it's fascinating to me. It's not just fundies who are looking at how things are or where things are going and making these assessments. It's a lot of people, or that could just be my YouTube algorithm, giving me what I think I want to see. But no,
check out the fashion YouTubers and makeup tutorial girls.
Then I would just be bombarded with those videos. But in any case, I think that, it holds that, we are seeing this awakening, this groping for this approach to the forest passage among a lot of outspoken individuals in alternative media primarily, but also in a lot of books and analysis of politics as we're seeing it today. So there is hope, I think.
What direction to go in? Really quick on what you were saying, Ilan. One of the things that I thought then is, okay, he's writing this in like 1950, and from his perspective, he was right that it only takes a minority. But I think he was speaking and writing from a particular time period. This was after the fall of fascism in Germany, and the fascists were in power. How many years, Luke? Like
12, right? No,
from 33,
33 till 45.
Yeah, so 12 years.
12, yeah.
So a very short period of time. By this time, the Soviets had been in power for almost 30 or just over 30 years, give or take with the Civil War. Lobachevsky would have called that still a very early phase in pathocracy. By the 70s, for Lobachevsky in Poland, for instance, now Poland might be a special case as a country that perceived itself as being under like a foreign occupation. In Poland, Lobachevsky wasn't the only one that said that by the 70s and 80s, it was like 80+% of the population who were firmly anti the rulers, anti the system, against the system. There was another poll, I think it was Tirmand, I can't remember. Well, I can't remember. I've got it in a footnote in Ponerology, where he was in the United States speaking with I think it was like a black academic in the States, and this guy had asked him, well, if you were to have a free vote in Poland, what percentage would the anti-communists get? And this Pole who'd come back, was in exile essentially, had said, probably 85%. And this academic just couldn't believe it. He couldn't comprehend that many people could be against the system. Well, and his perspective was that could be against the system and it would still be in power. But that just shows the amount of solidarity, to use an appropriate phrase for Poland, the solidarity of the people that had built up through those like two generations, or well, one generation for the Poles, and that ties into some stuff Jünger says about the nature of freedom. Like he's got one passage where he says that freedom, something like true freedom is what revivified, it brings together like fathers and brothers and workers. I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but it's this new power that solidifies, that brings people together in like a new community. Everything's revivified. So I just wanted to bring that up as kind of like things are even though a small minority in Junger's of Junger's forest rebels can have a big effect. He's saying that after decades, you've got that small minority, but you've also got the support of, what Lobachevsky calls the society of normal people. You've got most of the people on your side, which is a lot more optimistic. But I wanted to get back.
Just quicker. I think maybe the forest rebels they might have had an impact, right, on the society of normal people. They might have been the early adopters, so to speak, and the trailblazers.
Yes. Right. Exactly. But I want to get back to what you were saying, Luke, about what's better, to be in this unfree system where you have these great things, or this free system where you've got these not so great things. That reminded me of this passage from earlier on in the book, about halfway through. So he ends a section by saying that nevertheless, it would have been impossible to start with this part of the task. I don't remember which part of the task he's talking about, but a part of the task, since the necessary is given first. So the necessary is like the stuff that you can't control. It's the material conditions, it might be the catastrophe, whatever. He distinguishes the necessary from, what was the word he uses? The free or something, the sovereign. I can't remember, but that's the forest passage, the part within, the still eternal part of oneself. So he says, the necessary is given first. It may come our way as coercion, as sickness, as chaos, even as death. In any event, it must be understood as a test. Things cannot, therefore, come down to a question of modifying the blueprint of the work world. If anything, the great destruction lays the plans bare. That said, other edifices could certainly be erected than the termite mounds that the utopias partly foster, partly dread. The project is not as simplistic as all that. Neither is it a question of refusing to pay the times the toll they demand. Duty and freedom can be reconciled. So that's one point he ends one section with, and then he starts the next one with this. Here is another objection to consider. Should we count on catastrophe? Should we, if only intellectually, seek out the most distant waters, the cataracts, the maelstroms, the great abysses? The objection should not be underestimated. There is much to be said for staking out the safe routes that reason suggests and sticking to them with all our will. So this is another example of his qualifications. Right? And this discussion has come up in the past for me before as like the value of suffering, because there is value in suffering and growth from suffering. Now, if that's the case, if we say that suffering is a good in like the Platonic sense, then shouldn't we seek out the worst forms of suffering? Like that essentially makes suffering a good. And therefore that means the worst things that we can submit ourselves to and submit others to are good, because to make someone else suffer is ultimately good for them, because they're going to they could get something good out of it. So that means rape, child abuse, murder, torture, all those things are great because suffering leads to good things. Now, of course, that sounds like an absurdity, because it is an absurdity. He's saying that it's not quite like that. It's not like we should seek out, utter coercion and torture and like annihilation, extinction, genocide. These aren't the things that we should be seeking. There's a different dynamic going on. And that's why he says that, there is much to be said for staking out the safe routes that reason suggests and sticking to them with all our will. Like all other things being equal, it probably is better if we can find alternative ways of gaining our suffering than subjecting ourselves to like the worst form of tyranny imaginable. But so this is my own thought that ties into something that's come up in this discussion, and that's like, how to put it? I've forgotten what led to it, but what led to the train of thought. But maybe, no, it'll come back to me. So I'm gonna ignore that direction for now, and We might have to do another show on this because there's so much more good stuff.
Well, maybe we can just pick up where you were mentioning his point about, finding this path of least resistance, and how, there may in fact be, even if he doesn't state this explicitly, a certain amount of chosen suffering, like Peterson talks about, choosing your suffering. So, maybe there is a certain amount of effort and struggle that exists within the bounds of choosing your own suffering that can be, a form of finding the forest passage that doesn't look like something that's more confrontational or aggressive.
I mean, just seeking out, just understanding the evilness of, the conditions you live under itself provides a form of suffering, right? So I think it's like the point is more that suffering cannot really be evaded in that sense, and so it would be rather pointless to wage all-out war, on suffering. That's just not going to happen, and certain suffering you might even want to seek, right? Things that make you uncomfortable that might be important, for example. But I get his. I kind of didn't remember that passage, but I find it interesting because I've written a post on Substack about that very question a while ago, because the moment you say that, suffering can be positive, then it kind of follows logically that you kind of want to maximize suffering, right? So, and even start wars or whatever. I mean, you can take that further, and so that's kind of like an issue. But I think the general idea is that it's just not possible to, first of all, to avoid suffering altogether, and then also the acknowledgement. I mean, I actually like how Jünger put it, right? That the reasonable path or staking of a reasonable path, so to say, is just common sense, right? So you that's all you have to say about that. But then again, this reasoning that suffering might be worthwhile, it also sets boundaries, right? It protects you from trying to erase all suffering, like worldwide, for everybody, always, right? Because that just will lead to totalitarianism of the highest order, right? And I mean, it's just what we're seeing today, right? This idea is kind of like this spiral, where one day you force people to wear helmets on their bicycles, right? But then next day some guy dies because he got spiked by a tree while riding bicycles. So so we want to protect against that too. So let's wear it's making mandatory to wear an armor. I mean, you can. This game just has no end, right? And so I think it's useful to acknowledge the importance of suffering, just to set certain boundaries.
And I remembered what the point that I was going to make was, at least partially, and that's kind of tied to it. It's that I'm not sure how exactly to formulate the connection, but so with the safetyism, with constantly coming up with ways of protecting from new harms. Well, the purpose of suffering might be something like, if you don't know something, if you haven't learned a particular lesson, then you'll run up against an obstacle. And that obstacle, that suffering, will prompt you to learn something about it. And it will hopefully prompt you to learn the thing that you didn't know beforehand. Now, again, this works on all levels, from the very trivial to the very sublime. So it can be as simple as, any form of learning, learning to hammer a nail. If you don't know how to hammer a nail, you're going to hammer your thumb, and then and then learn, okay, there's actually a technique. I didn't know how to do this. This is a purely like functional kind of activity. If I don't know how to hammer a nail, I'm going to hurt myself. Now, when it gets into the level of like psychology and human interaction, the dynamics are going to be more complex and not as obvious, because, anyone can just look at the mechanics of hammering nails and come to the conclusion, okay, well, if you don't do it right, you're going to get hurt. So a person with more foresight and forethought than others will take that into account and might not hurt themselves, and might learn quicker. But there are areas of human interactions where we're just totally unprepared, where we have no idea what we're doing, what the possible consequences are going to be, and we have to kind of just stumble in the dark and go through hell in order to find out that, oh, maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And so that's the way I kind of see this, like these catastrophes and fitting that in with what Junger's talking about. Should we seek out catastrophes? How do we prepare for catastrophes? Well, is it catastrophes that actually give us, that actually that actually revivify that sacred wellspring, that underground stream that we've lost sight of? Like the catastrophe like literally breaks up the earth so that figuratively breaks up the earth so that the water will come through, the inner water. So what's going on there? Well, this tied back to me for the discussion, or what you were saying, what you were saying about progress. And the kind of progressive myth that we're all, going in this direction. Well, I think there's a truth to the progressive myth. I don't think I think that when you look at it just on a very common sense, basic level, it's impossible to deny either a progressive element or a conservative element. Because really, if there were any real conservatives, we would all be still Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, right? Nothing stays the same in the world. There's nothing that's truly conservative in the, I wouldn't say truly conservative. There's nothing conservative in the obvious, like, what would be the right adjective? In the obvious, like, dictionary definition, like pedantic sense. I don't know. There's nothing like stereotypically like conservative. It's like, oh, well, we have things are good and they just have to stay the same. Like, that's not how the world works. That's not how humans work. That's not how anything works. Things stay the same. The only thing that doesn't stay the same is like, well, I was going to say the laws of nature, but even that, there's wiggle room there. There are very few things that absolutely stay the same forever and are completely static. In that sense, there's no such thing as conservatism per se. And same thing with progressivism. It's not like things totally change and leave behind the past completely. Parts of the past get carried through just naturally, and some unintentionally, and some intentionally, and some you just can't escape. Like, there are things about human nature that are just conservative in the sense that you can't get rid of them. You can't totally deny and change human nature like some think that you can. So the only rational course is some mixture of conservatism and progressivism, with the acknowledgement that things will change. Some things which are good will continue and should continue, and some things need to change. Some things need to change to go along with the times and should be changed and incorporated as we learn them, which can then be conserved as a kind of conservatism. So like rational, like common sense politics would acknowledge elements of both. And you'd probably even find a lot of agreement between so-called conservatives and so-called progressives or liberals about which things need to be preserved and some of the things that need to be progressed. But things also well, so I guess that's just my point there. Progress and conservative. So some things can progress, some things should be conserved. But how's it going to tie this into to this idea of catastrophes and evil? Well, and learning lessons, and the suffering that comes. So when we run up against something that we don't, or when we don't know something and we run up against the consequences of not knowing, that produces a catastrophe. Now, I hold out the not quite firm conviction, but the possibility that it's true, that it is possible to learn things and to implement things to avoid certain kind of catastrophes. that cycles, even if nature is cyclical, that we can come to understand them to a degree to at least mitigate the horrors of like traditional cycles. And this has already happened. So if you look at secular cycles, if you look at the agricultural cycles, we've already, to a large degree, ameliorated some of the worst aspects of secular cycles. Now, not all of them, because we still have civil wars, we still have wars, we still have natural disasters, but to a large degree, we've avoided the famines, for instance, that accompanied the ends of secular cycles to a pretty good degree. Like we have nowhere near the level of famines that you had regularly in agricultural societies for like thousands of years. That's just one example, and that came not from actually understanding the dynamics of the cycle. That came purely through like new modes, through industrialization, like new technological modes. But I know that Peter Turchin, for instance, in Ages of Discord, at the end of the book, he writes that basically, we can learn a few things from cliodynamics, from the dynamics that shape secular cycles, and take them into account. First we have to realize that we know these things. And then we have to just agree on, okay, these are the things that happen. This is how they happen. Maybe we could try these things to avoid them. At the very least, we could try. And then maybe we wouldn't run into the same problems in the future. So I think that a lot of the recurring problems that we have aren't necessarily that they're like set in stone. It's that we haven't learned certain lessons. We haven't learned certain things. And once we do, maybe we won't have to suffer those types of suffering anymore. Maybe we'll have new types of suffering to engage in. And maybe just like the example of the Titanic with the dispensary going down, maybe we can learn which types of suffering to avoid other types of suffering. And maybe that by the very act of learning certain types of suffering, we will avoid other types of suffering. So that's just to say that, that I think there is more room for hope and that that certain evils, certain types of suffering may be possible for them to become superfluous, given that we learn certain things and implement certain other things.
So then would it be maybe fair to say that, seeking suffering is a goal to the extent that seeking out suffering, the goal of which is to, how did you put it? Make as much suffering superfluous as possible.
Yeah, well, certain types of suffering.
Yeah,
yeah. Like maybe we can avoid gulags and widespread torture and executions on trumped up charges. Like maybe some of those things we can reduce them to like a very minimum, as opposed to having like in the Soviet Union, when in like 1937 and 38, where something like, I don't know, like hundreds of thousands of people were charged and executed, like more than the entire history of executions in like the United States, for instance. Like multiple times, all of the people that have ever been executed by the state in the United States, multiple times that were executed in the Soviet Union in a period of 2 years. Like maybe we can get it so that doesn't happen again.
So then you are, instead of creating such a situation where that occurs, or going to where that situation might be occurring at present, you are, because what are you going there for? Like, are you seeking some kind of like a sublime state of transcendence, or is it to learn something, or because you're going to be learning something one way or another. So it just seems to me that what you will be learning under those circumstances, whether or not you seek them out or they just happen upon you, those will be the things that you learn in the process anyways. So if ahead of time you learn or figure out that, hey, the reason why these kinds of things happen is because of ponerization, then you can take that knowledge and do some intentional suffering, which is to say dispensing with whatever ideological foundations you might have held previously and disregard them as being irrelevant or unhelpful in preventing the ponerization process, and then implement whatever policies might be indicated for preventing the ponerization process, so that way you not only transcend to suffering like in the here and now, but also in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something like that.
Well, for one thing, being prepared mentally in some sense, Adam, is like it reduces the shock and the freeze response of certain catastrophic events. If we're not necessarily anticipating a certain development, but at least seeing its broad strokes and its formation, then, maybe when it does come full force and into existence and is obvious or more obvious than it was yesterday, it's, there's a certain sense of, healthier detachment from it, less of a, it's still going to be shocking to some degree, I think, even if certain things are in the offing or think that they are, or that will probably occur. There's still a sense of, wow, when it actually does occur, especially, just keeping aware of certain developments and events as they're happening today in the news. But I think what you're saying, and I think what's possible is the mental preparation that may benefit us and at least ameliorate a level of surprise that doesn't make us completely useless in the face of it. That there may be some things in the mechanism, in our being, in our awareness, that say, there's like okay, I'm recognizing this now. Holy shit, this is quite bad. However, I did know this was quite possibly something that was going to occur, and now I just need to sit with it, and maybe even, it'll just that very knowledge of seeing it for exactly what it is can give us that much more a measure of freedom to say, okay, if this is how it is, then within these parameters, within this level of freedom, less freedom I may have, I can still do this. I can still respond internally or externally in this way. I can still share what it is I think I'm seeing with someone else who sees it similarly, and come up with some constructive or healthy or beneficial response, or the best response in a spectrum of responses that may not be helpful, that some people may feel that they've been coerced or forced to make. So it's like it's just quite simply making the best of a not so great situation, and maybe in some instances that's enough. Not making things worse for oneself and those around us.
Yeah, and apart from these direct act or like consequences of the forest passage, if applied properly, right? Maybe there's even like something more going on along the lines that Jünger talked about with the physician who heals a patient just by the very act of breaking out of the bureaucracy of the machine. And so maybe if there's enough people doing the forest passage, right? And just this sheer act of breaking free from this mechanized, deterministic, machine-like, bureaucratic inhumanity, or the state of inhumanity, basically. If enough people break out of that, maybe that in it and of itself can have a healing effect, right? And maybe help mitigate the cyclical catastrophes and shenanigans that otherwise would go on. I mean, it's a hopeful thought.
Right. And then it might be like we were talking about just earlier, where there is this small minority that kind of is the vanguard, this vanguard of forest rebels that then influences the majority. And if the majority actually can take that on, and it will basically, tying it back to what I was trying to get across just prior, is that maybe that can implement a kind of a more permanent kind of change. You know, if certain things can be implemented, if certain understandings can be widely popularized through the actions of this, you know, this small elite vanguard, then maybe that can have a larger effect than it has in the past, right? Mm-hmm. Because these things, we've had these revivifications of this forest passage, like being an understanding, like Junger's talking about, but maybe there are certain understandings that haven't been quite understood and articulated in such a way that they can stick, essentially. Basically, what I'm saying is that maybe the cyclicism of this whole process isn't a not a fatality, a fatalism, you know, that it's not something that is strictly determined, and that maybe it's just that there are just some things that humanity hasn't quite figured out yet, and that we might be able to figure them out. And that's the hope of reason and like consciousness and science, is that we can actually figure things out to a certain degree. It's like, maybe we won't ever be able to know like the whole truth as we are, with our minds as they are, like everything that can possibly ever be known, you know, that's reserved to God, to God alone. But we can figure some things out better than we understood them previously. It's like, I mean, we can fly in planes, whereas previously we couldn't. You know, there are certain things that we learn, and then through cultural transmission, we, you know, transmit to future generations. And that are, you know, that it would be a tragedy to lose. You know, there's a whole history of culture, and that includes all of the like human knowledge that is only passed down, you know, because through the transmission to future generations. If that were to be cut off, that would be a big tragedy. That would be that would be a catastrophe. So that's just I just see that's where I think. That's where our understanding of progress comes from. It's something very deep. It is that increasing knowledge about the world, about ourselves, and not just knowledge of the world as it is, but how we also shape it, and the things we, you know, the novel things that we introduce into it, which then shapes it in this like complex recursive process. And so I think that's where there's some hope. For me, at least. But unless you guys have any final words, I think we can end it there for today and do one more show, because I still want to talk about crime. Maybe, a couple of the chapters. Maybe we can talk about other stuff too, but I want to get back to that. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, everyone. This has been Mind Matters, and we'll see you next week.